Good evening and welcome back. Tonight we're exploring a world that lives at the edge of memory and imagination, a place where stone walls rise against bitter winds and the simple act of sleeping becomes a contest for survival. What was it like to lie down at night in a medieval castle, to face the cold without central heating, without insulation, without any of the comforts we now take for granted? We'll journey through the chambers and corridors, exploring the strategies people used to endure winter nights when even wealth could not guarantee warmth. From featherbeds to shared body heat, from warming pans to prayers whispered against frost, we'll uncover how the medieval world fought its nightly battle with the cold. As always, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from and what time it is for you. Whether you're here to drift into sleep or to follow the currents of history, I'm glad you're with me. Now let's begin. Imagine stepping into a medieval castle at dusk. The torches along the corridor flicker, casting shadows that dance across walls thick enough to withstand battering rams. The stones beneath your feet feel solid, permanent, built to last centuries. Yet as you move deeper into the keep, you notice something. The air grows colder with each step. Your breath begins to fog. The temperature inside feels barely different from the winter landscape beyond the walls. This wasn't a flaw in construction. It was the reality of medieval architecture. Castles were designed for defense, not comfort. Those magnificent stone walls that could shrug off arrows and siege engines also acted like giant refrigerators, trapping cold air and radiating chill inward. The Great Hall might offer temporary relief. A massive hearth dominates one end, logs blazing, sparks dancing upward into the smoke-stained rafters. People gather close, their faces glowing orange in the firelight. For a few hours, the hall feels almost warm, almost welcoming. The smell of roasted meat mingles with smoke and spilled ale. Dogs scavenge beneath trestle tables. Laughter rises above the crackle of flames. But this warmth is fragile, contained to a narrow circle around the fire. Step back from the hearth and the cold reasserts itself immediately. Your shoulders stiffen. Your toes begin to ache. The vast space above swallows heat like a hungry thing. When the feast ends and guests depart for their chambers, they leave behind this island of warmth and venture into corridors that feel like caves. The walk from the Great Hall to the sleeping quarters was often described as a shock. You move from firelit comfort into passages lit only by a single torch. Draft pours through arrow slits and unsealed doorways. The temperature drops so quickly you can feel it stealing warmth from your skin. Your cloak, which felt too heavy near the fire, now seems inadequate. By the time you reach your chamber door, you're already shivering. This transition defined medieval nights, the brief moment of gathering warmth followed by the long surrender to cold. The bedchamber itself offered little reassurance. Stone walls rose on all sides, their surfaces damp with condensation. In some castles, frost formed on the interior walls during the deepest winter. Travelers wrote of waking to find their wash basins frozen solid, ice glittering in the morning light. The window openings, sealed only with wooden shutters or oiled cloth, rattled in the wind. Cold air seeped through every crack and gap. The floor, covered in rushes that grew musty and damp, offered minimal insulation. Even the grandest chambers in the wealthiest castles struggled to maintain temperatures above freezing on the coldest nights. Yet people survived. They developed elaborate systems, layering strategies upon strategies to carve out pockets of warmth in this hostile environment. The bed became not just furniture but a survival machine. Picture it now, a massive four-poster frame, rising high off the floor, tall as a person, its posts carved from oak. Heavy curtains hung from all sides. Thick wool or tapestry that could be drawn closed to create a smaller space within the larger room. This wasn't decoration. It was engineering. Once those curtains were pulled tight, your body heat, your breath, the warmth of your companion or your dog, all collected in that enclosed space. The difference could be startling. Outside the curtains, the chamber remained bitter. Inside, the air grew almost tolerable. The mattress itself varied by wealth and status. Nobles slept on feather beds, thick sacks stuffed with goose or duck down. These provided not only cushioning but genuine insulation, trapping air and warmth. You sank into them, enveloped by softness that seemed miraculous in such harsh surroundings. But feather beds came with their own challenges. They could become suffocatingly hot, trapping so much heat that sleepers woke drenched in sweat even in winter. They also required constant maintenance, regular beating and airing to prevent the feathers from clumping and to drive out the insects that inevitably took up residence. Most people, however, slept on straw ticks, large cloth sacks filled with straw or hay. These were cheap, easy to refill, and moderately effective at lifting the body off the cold floor, but straw flattened quickly under weight. By morning, you might feel every lump and board beneath you. The straw also harbored fleas and mice. Households beat their mattresses regularly, literally whacking them with sticks to fluff the filling and shake out vermin. The sound of this beating echoed through castles each morning, a domestic rhythm as regular as church bells. Some people mixed herbs into the straw, lavender or rosemary or mint, hoping the scent would mask the smell of damp hay and discourage pests. The bedding piled on top mattered just as much as what lay beneath. Linen sheets formed the base layer, smooth against the skin though offering little warmth. Over those came wool blankets, heavy and scratchy, but essential for trapping heat. Wealthy households added fur coverlets, fox or sable or bearskin, dense and warm. The weight of all these layers could be immense. Some people compared it to being pinned beneath armor. Moving required effort. Turning over meant lifting blankets so heavy they resisted. But this weight was welcome. It pressed warmth into the body, creating a cocoon that, once established, could sustain you through the night. The ritual of preparing for bed began long before you actually lay down. Servants moved through chambers in the late afternoon, beginning the slow process of making the space marginally habitable. They hung fresh tapestries if the household could afford them, these thick woven cloths covering damp stone walls and cutting the worst of the drafts. They scattered clean rushes across the floor, sometimes mixing in dried herbs. They built up the fire in the chamber hearth if one existed, feeding it logs until flames roared. And they prepared the warming pan, that curious brass implement that would become essential to comfort. The warming pan was simple but ingenious. Picture a long wooden handle attached to a flat brass pan with a perforated lid. Hot coals from the hearth went inside. A servant then slid this contraption back and forth between the sheets, the coals radiating heat through the metal, warming the fabric. The process took several minutes. You could smell the faint scorch of linen, see wisps of smoke rising. When finally you climbed into bed, those first moments felt almost luxurious. The sheets were warm, inviting, a stark contrast to the frigid air, but the warmth faded quickly. Within an hour, the cold reasserted itself. The warming pan couldn't heat the whole night, only ease its beginning. Clothing played a crucial role. Unlike our modern habit of changing into pajamas, medieval people often went to bed wearing nearly as much as they wore during the day. A long linen nightshirt was standard, loose and reaching to the ankles. Over that you might add a wool tunic if the night was especially cold. Most importantly, you wore a nightcap, a close-fitting cloth cap that covered your head and ears. Medieval medicine held that most body heat escaped through the head, and while their understanding was imperfect, the instinct was sound. Covering your head did help retain warmth. Manuscripts show figures tucked into bed with caps firmly in place, looking more prepared for travel than for sleep. Your feet received special attention. Some people wrapped them in strips of linen or wool before bed, creating makeshift socks. Others placed heated stones wrapped in cloth at the foot of the bed. Primitive hot water bottles that radiated warmth for hours. One account describes noble families filling leather pouches with heated sand, which conformed to the shape of the feet and retained heat longer than stone. These small innovations, born of desperation and ingenuity, made the difference between endurable cold and genuine misery. But perhaps the most effective strategy was the simplest. You didn't sleep alone. In a world where every degree of warmth mattered, body heat became currency. Servants often slept in adjoining rooms or on pallets at the foot of the master's bed. The arrangement served multiple purposes. It provided security and immediate assistance if needed, but it also meant more warmth in the space. 2 bodies generated more heat than 1. 3 or 4 bodies could genuinely raise the temperature of a small enclosed area. Children rarely had separate rooms. They slept in nurseries close to kitchens where ovens radiated residual heat, or they crowded together in beds, sometimes 3 or 4 to a mattress. Young pages and squires training in noble households bunked in groups. Soldiers in barracks lined up in rows, their collective warmth making the space more tolerable than any individual chamber could be. Even among the wealthy, bed sharing was common. Married couples naturally slept together, but travelers often shared beds with strangers at inns, and visiting nobles might find themselves paired with other guests. Privacy mattered less than survival. Animals played their part too. Dogs were especially valued, not just as companions but as heaters. A large hound curled at your feet could keep toes from going numb. 2 or 3 dogs in the bed created genuine warmth. The phrase three-dog night, though coined much later, captured a medieval reality. The coldest nights required the most dogs. Even nobles who normally maintained strict separation between themselves and animals made exceptions in winter. Lapped dogs, bred small for noble ladies, served as living hot water bottles, tucked against the body beneath blankets. Some households went further. In rural areas and even in some castle courtyards, animals were stabled close to living quarters. The heat from horses, cattle, and sheep radiated through shared walls. Travelers occasionally chose to sleep in stables rather than guest rooms, finding the animal warmth preferable to the drafty chambers above. The smell was strong, but comfort trumped dignity. Farmers sometimes brought livestock inside their cottages during the worst weather, creating a pungent but warm environment where humans and animals shared space and heat. Sensory world of a medieval bedroom at night was overwhelming. The smell of smoke clung to everything, having seeped into tapestries and blankets over months of fires. Damp wool, never quite dry, gave off its characteristic lanolin-rich odor. The rushes on the floor released earthy scents of straw and herbs, mixed with less pleasant notes from spilled food and mouse droppings. If you shared your bed with dogs, their fur added another layer to the olfactory mix. Human sweat, rarely washed away completely, permeated the linen, and underneath it all, the mineral smell of damp stone, cold and ancient. The sounds formed their own tapestry. Wind moaned through arrow slits and around tower corners. Shutters rattled. Somewhere in the castle, a door banged. The fire in the hearth crackled and popped. Logs settled with sighs and crashes. If you listened carefully, you might hear water dripping, condensation running down walls. In communal sleeping areas, snores and coughs echoed off stone. Dogs shifted and sighed. Mice scurried through the rushes. The castle itself seemed to breathe, its timbers creaking, its stones groaning under the weight of centuries. Touch was equally vivid. The linen sheets felt smooth but cool until your body warmed them. Wool blankets scratched against exposed skin, their weave coarse and rough. Fur coverlets, if you had them, felt dense and slightly oily. The straw mattress beneath poked through the thick cloth, sharp points pressing into shoulders and hips. Your nightcap hugged your head, sometimes too tight, leaving marks on your forehead by morning. The air on your face felt sharp and cold, making you burrow deeper into the covers. Every shift released a puff of straw-scented air from the mattress. The visual experience, once candles were extinguished, was near total darkness. Even on clear nights, little moonlight penetrated the thick walls and small windows. Inside your bed curtains, darkness was absolute. You couldn't see your hand before your face. This darkness, so complete by modern standards, became a kind of companion. It muffled the world, creating a small private universe where you existed, with only your thoughts and the sensation of warmth slowly building around your body. Yet sleep was not continuous as we know it today. Medieval people practiced what scholars now call segmented sleep. You fell asleep after dark, slept for several hours, then woke naturally around midnight. During this interval, you might lie quietly, pray, tend the fire, check on children, or even engage in conversation with bed partners. After an hour or two, you returned to sleep until dawn. This pattern wasn't considered abnormal. It was simply how sleep worked when nights stretched long and bodies adapted to the rhythm of darkness. Tending the fire was often part of this midnight waking. Embers died without attention, and a dead fire meant a freezing chamber by morning. Someone had to rise, stumble across the cold floor, and add logs to the hearth. The cold air hit like a slap. Your breath fogged immediately. Your bare feet ache against the stone, even through the rushes. You stirred the embers with a poker, blew gently to encourage flames, and carefully placed new wood. Sparks flew, smoke billowed. Slowly the fire caught, and warmth began to spread again. You hurried back to bed, grateful to slide beneath the covers that now felt even warmer by contrast. In monasteries, bells rang throughout the night, calling monks to prayer at regular intervals. This ensured that someone was always awake, always moving, always checking that fires remained lit, and that the community remained safe. The practice of the hours, praying at set times through day and night, served both spiritual and practical purposes. It kept the cold at bay through vigilance and activity. Monks rose in darkness, chanted in candlelit chapels, then returned to their narrow cots in dormitories where rows of brothers slept side by side, their collective warmth making the space bearable. Communal sleeping was the norm for many. Soldiers in castle garrisons bedded down in barracks' long halls filled with rows of straw mattresses. The smell of leather, sweat, and smoke filled the air. Men snored, coughed, and shifted through the night. Privacy was impossible, but the body heat of dozens made the cold less severe. Servants slept in similar conditions, crowded into lofts or storage rooms, using cloaks as blankets and wadded garments as pillows. Apprentices in workshops curled up near ovens or forges, seeking warmth wherever it lingered. Even noble households weren't exempt from crowding. Extended families, guests, and retainers all required accommodation. Castles teemed with people, and most spaces served multiple functions. What was a dining hall by day might become sleeping quarters by night. Pallets rolled out across the floor. What was a storage room could house half a dozen servants. The modern notion of private bedrooms for everyone was unthinkable. Space was shared, warmth was shared, and survival depended on the press of bodies. Food and drink before bed served as internal heating. A bowl of thick pottage, barley and peas simmered until dense, lined the stomach and provided calories that the body burned for warmth through the night. Ale consumed warm, filled bellies and induced drowsiness. Wealthy households served spiced wine, heated with cinnamon and ginger, its sweetness masking the vinegar taste of mediocre vintages. You drank it slowly, feeling warmth spread through your chest. The heat was temporary, but it eased the transition from waking to sleep. Some people believed certain foods held warming properties. Garlic eaten before bed was thought to prevent frostbite. Whether through genuine physiological effect or folk belief, leeks were recommended to warm the belly. Honey mixed into heated milk soothed and comforted. Medieval medicine, based on the theory of humors, held that cold threatened the body's inner balance. Warm foods and drinks were prescribed as medicine, meant to keep the humors from congealing and causing illness. Medical treatises warned that sleeping in cold, damp chambers could breed disease. Physicians advised rubbing feet with warm oil before bed to open the pores and expel harmful chill. They recommended hanging tapestries not for beauty, but for health, blocking the damp that seeped from stone walls. They prescribed heated stones and warm drinks as preventive medicine. To them, warmth wasn't luxury, it was medical necessity. Folk remedies flourished alongside official medicine. People tied wool soaked in vinegar around their legs to improve circulation. They rubbed garlic or onion on the soles of their feet, believing it prevented cold from entering the body. They hung bunches of herbs above beds to purify the air and ward off illness. Rosemary, lavender, and juniper were popular choices. The scents mingled with smoke and wool, creating complex aromatic layers that defined the medieval sleeping chamber. Superstition and faith also guarded the night. People whispered prayers before sleeping, asking saints for protection against cold, illness, and evil spirits. Crosses were carved into bed frames or hung on walls. Some placed iron objects beneath pillows, believing metal repelled demons that prowled in darkness. Others turned their shoes upside down beside the bed, a charm against frost. These gestures, part prayer and part magic, gave psychological comfort. They created a sense of control in a world where so much felt beyond human power. The night itself was suspect. Darkness harbored dangers both real and imagined. Thieves and murderers moved under cover of blackness. Fires could start and spread unseen. Illness struck in the night, fevers rising while families slept, and beyond the rational fears lurked supernatural ones. The night hag, a creature blamed for suffocating sleepers, demons who slipped through cracks in walls, spirits of the restless dead. Medieval people navigated both physical and spiritual threats each time they closed their eyes. Yet there was beauty too. On clear winter nights, moonlight filtered through oiled cloth windows, casting soft amber glows across chambers. Shadows from the hearth fire danced on tapestried walls, creating moving pictures of hunts and battles. The silence of deep night, when wind calmed and snow muffled all sound, held a peace that felt almost sacred. In those quiet hours, wrapped in blankets with the faint warmth of embers glowing nearby, sleep felt less like surrender and more like trust. Children were especially vulnerable to cold. Their small bodies generated less heat and lost it faster. Parents wrapped infants in layer after layer of linen and wool, swaddling them so tightly the babies could barely move. Cradles were placed near hearths or even in the parents' bed, where body heat offered protection. Young children slept together, sometimes 3 or 4 to a bed, their small forms creating warmth through proximity. Despite these precautions, many children didn't survive their first winters. Cold-related deaths, whether from hypothermia or from respiratory illnesses exacerbated by damp and chill, claimed countless young lives. The elderly faced similar risks. Their bodies produced less heat and tolerated cold poorly. In peasant families, grandparents claimed spots closest to the fire, while younger adults accepted colder positions. In castles, aged nobles might move into smaller chambers or even relocate near kitchens during winter. One letter describes an elderly woman who insisted on sleeping in the bakehouse, arguing that the oven's residual warmth gave her more comfort than any bedchamber could. These accommodations recognized vulnerability. The young and old required extra protection, and communities did what they could to provide it. Travelers faced perhaps the greatest challenge. On the road, you couldn't rely on familiar hearths or established routines. Inns offered shelter but little comfort. Guests often shared beds with strangers, sometimes 3 or 4 bodies pressed together on straw mattresses. The main hall fire provided communal warmth, but upstairs rooms were barely warmer than outside. Fleas and lice thrived in these crowded spaces. Privacy was non-existent, yet travelers had little choice. The alternative was sleeping outdoors, which in winter could be fatal. Some travelers preferred stables to guest rooms. Horses and cattle radiated significant heat, and a stable packed with animals could be surprisingly warm. The smell was intense, but pilgrims and merchants often chose comfort over dignity. They bedded down in straw beside livestock, wrapped in cloaks, trusting in animal warmth to see them through the night. Monasteries offered better accommodations, with guest halls specifically maintained for travelers. These spaces had their own hearths and cleaner bedding. Religious duty required monks to provide hospitality, and for travelers a monastery guest hall represented safety and relative comfort. The contrast between social classes shaped sleeping experiences profoundly. Nobles had access to better materials, more servants, and larger fuel supplies, yet their vast chambers were harder to heat than the smaller spaces of peasants. A lord might sleep on feather beds beneath fur coverlets, but if his chamber was cavernous and poorly sealed, he could still freeze. Meanwhile, a peasant in a small cottage, with family and animals all sharing one room and a single hearth, might actually sleep warmer despite having fewer resources. The irony wasn't lost on contemporaries. Some letters and diaries note that humble cottages, for all their poverty, sometimes offered more genuine comfort than grand castles. Architectural features evolved slowly to address the cold. The sola, a smaller private chamber often located on an upper floor, became standard in later medieval castles. These rooms, designed specifically for the lord and his family, were easier to heat than the great hall. Windows faced the sun, capturing whatever warmth daylight offered. Fireplaces were built into walls rather than sitting as open hearths in the center of rooms, improving their efficiency slightly. Wooden paneling began appearing, creating air pockets between wood and stone that offered minimal but real insulation. Tapestries served double duty as art and insulation. These massive woven cloths depicted scenes from the Bible, from classical mythology, from hunts and battles. They also hung heavy against stone walls, blocking the worst of the damp and drafts. Walking into a chamber lined with tapestries felt different from entering a bare stone room. The air seemed warmer, sounds were muffled, and the visual warmth of colors, reds and golds and blues, created psychological comfort. Nobles moved their favorite tapestries from castle to castle, transporting them in carts as essential household goods. Window treatments evolved as well. Early castles had simple wooden shutters that blocked wind but also light. Later, people stretched oiled linen across window openings, creating semi-translucent barriers that admitted dim light while reducing drafts. Some wealthy households imported thin sheets of horn, scraped translucent and set in frames. These horn windows were expensive but more durable than fabric. By the later Middle Ages, glass appeared in some castle chapels and private chambers, though it remained rare and costly. Even when glass was available, the panes were small and set in lead, offering limited protection against cold. Despite all these adaptations, winter remained brutal. Frost formed on interior walls. Water froze in basins overnight. Breath clouded in every room except directly beside the fire. People woke with aching joints, chilblains on fingers and toes, and coughs that lingered for weeks. The cold was relentless, and no amount of tapestries or blankets could fully defeat it. Survival required constant vigilance, nightly rituals repeated with the regularity of prayer. The psychological toll was significant. Medieval writers complained about the dread of leaving bed in the morning. They spoke of feeling imprisoned by blankets, reluctant to face the icy chamber beyond. Winter brought not just physical cold but emotional heaviness, what we might now recognize as seasonal affective disorder. Long dark nights, limited daylight, and constant discomfort weighed on the spirit. Some physicians of the era, noted that winter caused melancholy, a thickening of black bile in the humors. Their understanding was wrong in specifics but right in observation. Winter was hard not just on bodies but on minds. Yet communities endured. They gathered in great halls for feasts that doubled as heating sessions, hundreds of bodies and roaring fires creating temporary warmth. They told stories by firelight, entertainment that was also companionship and distraction from the cold. They sang, played music, drank, and laughed, creating psychological warmth to supplement physical heat. These gatherings were survival strategies as much as social events. They reminded people that they weren't alone in their struggle against winter. Religious faith offered another kind of warmth. Prayer provided structure to the long nights, breaking darkness into manageable pieces. The belief that suffering had meaning, that cold was a test of faith or a reminder of mortality, helped people endure. Monks embraced cold as a form of asceticism, offering their discomfort to God. Peasants trusted that enduring winter was simply part of the cycle ordained by divine will. This faith didn't make the cold less bitter, but it gave it context and purpose. Festivals and holidays punctuated winter darkness. Christmas celebrations brought extra fires, special foods, and communal joy. Twelfth Night, Candlemas, and other holy days marked progress through the season. Each feast was a milestone, proof that winter wasn't eternal, that warmth and spring would eventually return. People counted down toward these dates, measuring their endurance in the stretches between celebrations. Practical innovations continued to emerge. Some households experimented with heated bricks, warmed in the hearth, and then wrapped in cloth to place in beds. These retained heat longer than stones and conformed better to the body. Others tried thick leather curtains oiled to repel drafts. A few wealthy estates installed rudimentary hypocausts, Roman-style heating systems that circulated warm air beneath floors. These were rare and imperfect, but they showed people's determination to improve their circumstances. Clothing too became more sophisticated over the centuries. Better weaving techniques produced denser wool fabrics that trapped more warmth. Fur lining became standard in winter garments for those who could afford it. The cut of clothes changed, with longer sleeves, higher collars, and tighter fits that reduced heat loss. Undergarments multiplied, adding layers between skin and outer clothes. By the later Middle Ages, a well-dressed noble might wear 5 or 6 layers, each contributing to warmth. The gradual improvement of living conditions over the medieval period can be traced through these small changes. Early castles were stark fortresses, built purely for defense. Later castles incorporated more comfort features. Chambers grew smaller and easier to heat. Windows had better seals. Fireplaces improved in design. The shift was slow, taking centuries, but it reflected growing expectations. People came to demand not just survival but a degree of comfort. The very notion that nobility should live pleasantly, not merely safely, drove architectural evolution. Yet even at the end of the medieval period, castles remained cold. With breakthrough technologies that would truly transform indoor heating, cast iron stoves, efficient chimneys, eventually central heating, lay centuries in the future. Medieval people did the best they could with the materials and knowledge available. Their ingenuity was remarkable. From warming pans to bed curtains, from communal sleeping to heated drinks, they invented countless strategies to outwit the cold. The physical legacy of these efforts remains visible. Visit medieval castles today, and you can see the massive fireplaces, the hooks where tapestries hung, the small chambers that served as solars, the arrow slits that once whistled with draught. Stand in those spaces in winter, and you'll feel a ghost of what medieval people experienced. The stones still radiate cold. The wind still finds its way through cracks. Even with modern heating, these structures resist warmth. They were built for war, not comfort. And that original purpose shaped everything that came after. The stories told around medieval hearths often featured the cold as antagonist. Legends spoke of winters so severe that rivers froze solid and wolves came down from mountains to prowl castle walls. Chronicles recorded freak storms, sieges where cold killed more than combat, and years when spring came so late that people feared it never would. These stories served as warnings and also as badges of survival. To have endured a terrible winter became a mark of strength, something to recount to children and grandchildren. There were also stories of those who didn't survive. Guards found frozen at their posts. Travelers discovered in spring, curled beneath trees. Children who went to sleep and never woke. These grim tales circulated alongside the survival stories, reminders that the cold was genuinely dangerous. Medieval people didn't romanticize winter. They feared it, prepared for it, and breathed sighs of relief when it finally passed. Spring's arrival was celebrated with genuine joy. The first warm day, when you could walk outside without a cloak, felt miraculous. Windows could be opened without admitting freezing drafts. Fires could be allowed to die down. Blankets could be aired and stored. The transformation was gradual but profound. As temperatures rose and daylight lengthened, the nightly battle with cold eased. Sleep became easier, more restful, less of a survival challenge. The relief was almost physical, as though the whole society exhaled in unison. Summer brought its own challenges. Without screens, windows admitted insects. Without refrigeration, food spoiled quickly. Heat could be oppressive in stone chambers that held warmth as stubbornly as they held cold. But these were problems people welcomed after months of winter. Even the worst summer night seemed preferable to the icy misery of January. The cyclical nature of medieval life meant that each season's end brought anticipation of the next. As summer faded, people began preparing for winter again. Firewood was cut and stacked. Tapestries were brought out of storage. Fur coverlets were aired. Warming pans were checked for damage. The household rituals that would sustain them through cold months were rehearsed and made ready. This preparation was annual, repetitive, and essential. In this rhythm, sleep itself became seasonal. Winter sleep was heavy, communal, and defensive. You went to bed early, rose late, and spent long hours wrapped in blankets. Summer sleep was lighter, more individual with open windows and fewer coverings. Spring and autumn were transitions, times when you adjusted strategies, adding or removing layers as temperatures shifted. The medieval body adapted to these rhythms, expecting change and preparing for it. Now, as our journey through medieval sleep draws toward its close, picture one final scene. It's deep winter, the castle is quiet. In a chamber high in the keep, someone lies beneath heavy blankets. The fire has burned to embers, the wind has gentled. Outside, snow falls, soft and silent. Inside the bed curtains, darkness is complete. Breath fogs faintly. A dog sighs at the foot of the bed. The weight of wool and fur presses down like a protective hand. This sleeper doesn't move. The struggle to find warmth is over for now. The body has generated its small pocket of heat, defended by layers of fabric and the ingenuity of countless small preparations. Tomorrow will bring its own challenges. The shock of cold air when the curtains open, the need to dress quickly, the hunger that winter always brings. But for now, in this moment, there is rest. The castle sleeps too in its way. The stones hold their ancient chill. The tapestries hang motionless. The rushes on the floor settle into stillness. No servants walk the corridors. No dogs bark in the courtyard. The night deepens into that peculiar quiet that comes only in winter, when snow muffles everything and the world seems to hold its breath. In this stillness, you can almost hear the past. The whisper of wool against linen, the faint crackle of dying embers, the sigh of wind around tower corners. The sounds are soft now, gentle, no longer harsh or threatening. They become a kind of music, the lullaby of medieval night. And in that music, in that stillness, sleep finally comes. Not the instant unconsciousness of modern times, but a gradual drift. Thoughts dissolve. The body releases its tension. The cold recedes to the edges of awareness, still present, but no longer urgent. What remains is simply breath and heartbeat and the slow pull downward into dreams. This was how medieval people slept, when they slept at all, with difficulty, with discomfort, but also with remarkable resilience. They transformed hostile stone chambers into survivable spaces through ingenuity and community. They layered cloth and fur and ritual and faith until warmth became possible. They endured because they had no choice. And in that endurance they found ways to make even the coldest night bearable. So the tale of sleeping in medieval castles comes to rest here, in this quiet chamber, beside this single sleeper wrapped in blankets against the dark. The cold never disappeared, the stone never warmed, but people learned to live within those constraints, to carve out pockets of safety and rest. Their strategies were simple, their tools rudimentary, yet they worked well enough that life continued, generation after generation, through countless winters. The embers glow one last time, a faint orange pulse in the darkness, and then even that light fades. What remains is only warmth, held close by blankets and will. The sleeper breathes, steady and slow. Outside, snow continues to fall, covering the world in silence. Inside, sleep deepens, and the long medieval night holds everything gently until dawn. Dawn comes slowly to a medieval castle. The darkness doesn't break suddenly but rather thins by degrees, black fading to deep blue, then to grey. In the chamber where our sleeper rests, the first hint of morning arrives not as light but as sound. Somewhere far below a rooster crows. Noise penetrates through stone walls and closed shutters, piercing the cocoon of sleep. The sleeper stirs, reluctant, burrowing deeper into blankets that have finally achieved a comfortable warmth. But the day has begun whether welcomed or not. The cold announces itself immediately upon waking. During sleep, the body creates a microclimate of warmth beneath the covers. Movement disturbs this fragile ecosystem. A hand emerges to pull the curtain back, and icy air rushes in to claim the space. Fingers stiffen almost instantly. The sleeper gasps, breath visible in the dim light. The chamber has grown even colder during the night. The fire died hours ago. Frost patterns decorate the inside of the window shutters, delicate ferns of ice that would be beautiful if they weren't so unwelcome. Getting out of bed required courage. You knew what awaited. The moment your feet touched the floor, cold would shoot up through your legs. The rushes, damp with overnight condensation, would feel soggy and unpleasant. The air would assault every bit of exposed skin. Medieval people developed strategies for this transition. Some kept heavy robes within reach, grabbing them quickly to wrap around shoulders before standing. Others literally ran from bed to hearth, feet barely touching the floor, desperate to reach whatever warmth might linger near the fireplace. The morning routine began with rekindling the fire. If embers still glowed beneath the ash, this was easier. You knelt before the hearth, blowing gently, adding kindling until flames caught. Your face grew hot while your back remained frozen, a split existence between two temperatures. If the fire had died completely, the process was more laborious. You needed to strike flint against steel, catch a spark in tinder, nurse it into flame. Your hands shook with cold, making the work difficult. Smoke stung your eyes, but slowly, reluctantly, fire returned, pushing back the darkness and beginning to warm the chamber. Water for washing was often frozen solid. Chamber pots had ice crystals forming on their surfaces. To wash in winter meant breaking ice in the basin, then bracing yourself for the shock of freezing water against skin. Some people simply didn't wash much in winter. They wiped hands and faces with damp cloths when necessary but avoided full washing until weather improved. This was practical rather than slovenly. Exposing wet skin to freezing air invited illness. Better to remain unwashed than to risk fever. Dressing happened as quickly as possible. You pulled on layer after layer, each garment adding a fraction more warmth. Undertunic, overtunic, hose tied at the waist, shoes or boots, belt, cloak. Your fingers fumbled with laces and ties, still numb from the cold. The clothing felt stiff, having absorbed the chamber's chill overnight. Only gradually did your body heat begin to warm the fabric from within. Wealthy households had servants to help with dressing, but even servants were cold. Their movements quick and efficient, motivated by shared misery. Once dressed, you could finally leave the chamber. The corridor outside was no warmer, but at least you were moving. Movement generated heat. Nobles descended toward the great hall where breakfast waited. Servants headed to kitchens or to their daily tasks. Everyone sought warmth wherever it could be found. The castle came alive slowly, people emerging from their cold chambers like hibernating animals cautiously greeting spring. Breakfast in winter was important, not just for nutrition but for warmth. Hot porridge, bread fresh from the oven, warm ale or milk. These filled the stomach and heated the body from within. People gathered around tables in the great hall, where fires had been rebuilt by early rising servants. The hall gradually warmed, or at least the space immediately around the hearth did. Faces regained color. Fingers thawed. Conversation resumed. The worst of morning's cold was survived once more, but for many there was no time to linger. Work called. Peasants and villagers faced similar morning struggles. They woke in cottages where fires had died overnight. Children whimpered from the cold. Mothers wrapped them in whatever cloth was available while fathers coaxed fires back to life. Breakfast might be nothing more than stale bread and weak ale, but it was warm, and that mattered. Then out into the winter morning to tend animals or repair tools, or do whatever labor the season allowed. The medieval day was shaped by light more than by clocks. In winter, daylight came late and left early. The workable hours were few. People rose as soon as they could see and worked until darkness forced them to stop. This meant that in deep winter, the periods of activity were compressed. Intense bursts between long stretches of darkness. Much of life happened in twilight, That in-between time when you couldn't quite see properly but couldn't yet justify lighting expensive candles. Candles and rushes themselves were precious. Beeswax candles were luxury items, saved for important occasions. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat were more common but still represented resources. They smelled terrible when burning, giving off acrid smoke that added to the general fuge of medieval interiors. Rush lights, reeds soaked in fat, were the cheapest option. They burned quickly and unevenly but provided some illumination. In peasant cottages, people often worked and ate by firelight alone, saving even rushlights for special need. The division of labor in winter shifted. Outdoor work became limited. Fields lay fallow under snow or frozen mud. Livestock required care, feeding and watering even in bitter cold. But the work was less than in growing seasons. Instead, winter was a time for indoor tasks. Women spun wool, wove cloth, mended garments, prepared and preserved food. Men carved wood, repaired tools and equipment, worked leather. Children helped where they could, learning trades and skills while contributing to household productivity. In castles, winter brought its own rhythm. Noble families settled in for the season. Hunting continued when weather permitted. Though it was often miserable, riders returning frozen and exhausted. Indoor entertainments became important. Minstrels and storytellers earned their keep, providing distraction from the cold and darkness. Games of chess or dice passed time. People read, if they were literate, and if precious books were available. The wealthy could afford illuminated manuscripts, their colorful illustrations offering visual warmth even when physical warmth was scarce. Religious devotion intensified in winter. Churches and chapels, though also cold, offered spiritual warmth. Prayer services marked the hours. The liturgical calendar provided structure and meaning to winter's darkness. Advent and Christmas brought special celebrations. Saints' feast days punctuated the cold months. For many, faith was not just comfort but explanation. Winter was part of God's plan, a time of testing and reflection. Endurance was virtue. Survival was proof of divine favor. Yet tension existed between the comfort faith offered and the harsh reality of suffering. Priests preached about accepting hardship with grace. But when children died from cold-related illnesses, when elderly parents froze in their beds, when hunger gnawed at bellies because stores ran low, acceptance came hard. People questioned, doubted, even as they prayed. Medieval spirituality contained this tension, holding suffering and faith together in uneasy balance. The afternoon brought a subtle shift. If the day was clear, such days were rare but precious. Sunlight streamed through windows. Even winter sun provided some warmth. Chambers with southern exposure benefited most. People positioned themselves to catch whatever rays penetrated the gloom. Cats, ever practical, found sunny spots and claimed them. Humans followed their example, moving work to where light and marginal warmth coincided. But many winter days offered no sun. Grey skies, heavy with snow or simply thick with cloud, turned day into extended twilight. The world lost color. Everything rendered in shades of grey and white. This monotony wore on people. Chronicles and letters from winter months often mention the oppressive sameness of the days. Without variety, time seemed to slow. Each day bled into the next until people lost track of dates, measuring time instead by how much firewood remained or how many stores had been consumed. Food became increasingly important as winter progressed. Harvest's bounty, so abundant in autumn, dwindled steadily. Fresh food disappeared first. Then preserved items began running low. By late winter, the period sometimes called the Hungry Gap, even wealthy households felt the pinch. Peasants faced genuine threat of starvation. The last of the grain scraped from barrels, smoked meat and salted fish, already monotonous, became even more precious. People dreamed of fresh vegetables, of fruit, of flavors other than salt and smoke. Hunting helped supplement stores, but winter hunting was difficult. Animals were scarce, hidden in dens or migrated elsewhere. Deep snow made tracking nearly impossible. Hunters returned empty-handed more often than not. When they did succeed, the entire household celebrated. Fresh meat, even tough winter venison, was feast-worthy. Nothing was wasted. Bones went into soup. Organs were eaten. Hides were processed for leather. Every part of the animal represented survival. Fishing continued through winter where possible. Some rivers and streams remained unfrozen, their cold waters still harboring fish. Rostovslisyan still braved winter seas, though fishing was dangerous in storms and bitter weather. Salted and dried fish became staple protein when other sources failed. Its strong taste and rubbery texture made it unpopular. But hunger was an excellent source. People ate what they had and were grateful for it. The social hierarchy that defined medieval life became even more visible in winter. Nobles had resources, stores of food, supplies of firewood, servants to do the hardest labor. They suffered cold, yes, but not deprivation. Peasants had far less margin for error. A harsh winter could mean catastrophe. If firewood ran out, if food stores were insufficient, if illness struck, the consequences could be fatal. Yet even within this inequality there existed obligations. Lords were expected to provide some level of care for their dependents. Failures to do so damaged reputations and could spark unrest. Winter was also when violence could erupt. When resources grew scarce, tensions rose. Disputes over firewood rights, over access to remaining food stores, over debts and obligations. These could explode into conflict. Medieval legal records show spikes in certain crimes during winter months. Theft of wood or food, assaults stemming from arguments in crowded spaces, even murder, often arising from desperation or from tempers frayed by cold and hunger. Castles themselves could become prisons during the worst weather. When snow drifted deep or storms raged, travel became impossible. People were trapped inside, forced into proximity, whether they liked each other or not. Small irritations magnified into serious grievances. The lack of privacy, the constant noise, the smell of too many bodies in enclosed spaces, all wore on nerves. Household management required skill not just in organizing work but in managing interpersonal dynamics, keeping peace among people forced together by necessity. Women bore particular burdens during winter. In addition to their regular work, they served as primary caregivers for children and elderly. They managed household resources, deciding how to stretch dwindling supplies. They nursed the sick, of which there were many in winter. Respiratory illnesses flourished in cold, smoky, crowded conditions. Women brewed herbal remedies, applied poultices, sat vigil beside fevered family members. Their knowledge of healing herbs and folk medicine was crucial to survival. Childbirth in winter carried extra danger. Women already faced high maternal mortality rates. Cold made everything worse. Chambers couldn't be properly warmed. Water froze. The physical stress of labor was compounded by environmental harshness. Midwives did what they could, but their tools and knowledge were limited. Survival of both mother and infant often came down to luck as much as skill. Families prayed fervently during winter births, knowing the risks were heightened. Children suffered particularly from winter's effects. Their smaller bodies lost heat faster. They were more susceptible to illness, and they felt the psychological weight of being trapped indoors. Children need play, movement, stimulation. Winter restricted all of these. They became restless, quarrelsome, difficult. Parents tried to keep them occupied with tasks and stories, but long winter months tested everyone's patience. The spring emergence of children, finally able to run and play outside, was relief for entire communities. Education, such as it existed, continued through winter. Noble children might have tutors who taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and Latin. These lessons happened in cold chambers, with students bundled in cloaks, breath fogging as they recited declensions or practiced letters. Monasteries educated boys destined for religious life, young oblates shivering in unheated scriptoria as they learned to read and copy texts. Apprentices continued their training, though the work adapted to winter conditions. The learning never stopped because life and its demands didn't stop. Evening came early in winter. By mid-afternoon on the shortest days, darkness was already falling. Fires were built up, candles were lit, precious though they were. The household gathered once more in the great hall or around cottage hearths. Supper, the main meal, was served. This was often the social high point of the day. People shared food and warmth. They told stories. They sang. Musicians played if instruments were available. Ale flowed more freely in the evening, helping to dull the cold and the boredom. This evening gathering served multiple purposes. It was entertainment and warmth and community all at once. It reinforced social bonds that might fray under winter's pressure. It reminded people they weren't alone in their struggle. The collective experience of surviving another cold day became something to share, almost to celebrate. We made it through. We're still here. Tomorrow we'll do it again. But as evening deepened toward night, the cycle began again. The fire would be banked. Candles would be extinguished. People would prepare once more for the nightly battle with cold. Beds would be warmed with pans of hot coals. Blankets would be piled high. Dogs would be invited to join sleepers. Prayers would be whispered. And then the long darkness. the hours of lying still, trying to conserve warmth and find rest despite the cold. Some nights were worse than others. When wind howled around the castle, finding every crack and gap, sleep became nearly impossible. The castle itself seemed to shake, shutters banged, timbers groaned. The noise alone was enough to keep people awake. Add to that the penetrating cold that defeated even the best preparations, and you had nights that people simply endured rather than slept through. They lay awake, waiting for dawn, counting the hours until they could legitimately rise and rebuild the fire. Other nights brought different challenges. Heavy snow muffled sound but also trapped cold air. The silence was profound, almost oppressive. In that silence, every small noise amplified. A mouse scratching in the walls, a dog shifting position, the creak of the bed frame. These sounds became enormous in the darkness, sometimes frightening, always reminding you that you were awake when you desperately wanted to sleep. Illness disrupted sleep as well. Winter brought coughs, fevers, congestion. Sick people couldn't rest properly. They kept others awake with their coughing and restlessness. Families tended the ill through long nights, offering water, adjusting blankets, wiping fevered brows. The care was constant and exhausting. Wiping fevered brows. The care was constant and exhausting. When one family member fell ill, often others followed. Soon the entire household was coughing and miserable, everyone's sleep disturbed. Nightmares plagued winter sleep. Perhaps the stress of cold and confinement manifested in dreams. Medieval people believed dreams carried meaning, messages from God or warnings from the spirit world. Bad dreams were taken seriously. People woke frightened, convinced they'd been visited by demons or that their dreams predicted disaster. Morning would bring discussion and interpretation. Priests might be consulted. Prayers would be offered. The boundary between sleeping and waking world felt thin in winter's darkness. Some people experienced what we might now call sleep disorders. The combination of segmented sleep patterns, physical discomfort, stress, and irregular schedules created conditions where normal sleep became difficult. People might lie awake for hours despite exhaustion, or they might fall into such deep sleep that rousing them was nearly impossible. Medieval medicine had little understanding of sleep disorders, attributing problems to humoral imbalances or spiritual causes. Treatments were ineffective, leaving sufferers to simply cope as best they could. The very old sometimes spoke of winter sleep as a kind of death rehearsal. They felt the cold claiming their bodies, their extremities growing numb, their breathing becoming labored. Some nights they wondered if they would wake at all. This wasn't melodrama but realistic assessment. Elderly people did die in their sleep, often in winter when their weakened bodies simply couldn't maintain the fight against cold. Families understood this risk. They checked on elderly members through the night, making sure they still breathed, still had warmth. Death in winter was complicated by more than just its increased frequency. The ground froze solid, making burial difficult. Bodies of those who died had to be stored, sometimes for weeks, until the earth thawed enough for graves to be dug. This created practical and psychological burdens. Where did you keep a body? How did you prevent its decay, or at least minimize it? How did you mourn when final burial was delayed? Different communities had different solutions, but all faced the problem. Death couldn't wait for convenient weather. Religious belief offered framework for understanding winter death. It was part of the natural cycle ordained by God. All things had their season, including dying. Winter deaths were sad but not unexpected. The liturgy provided rituals for mourning. Prayers commended souls to heaven. Belief in afterlife offered comfort. Those who died were imagined as finally permanently warm, basking in divine light and love. This theology helped survivors cope with loss and with their own fear of winter's dangers. Yet, beneath the religious acceptance ran currents of fear and resentment. Why did God allow such suffering? Why did children freeze? Why did cold claim the vulnerable while the strong survived? These questions didn't have satisfying answers. Clergy offered explanations about original sin, about earthly life as testing ground, about rewards awaiting the faithful. But when you were cold and hungry and frightened, theology felt distant. The immediate experience was simply hard. Some people found meaning in winter's severity by framing it as spiritual exercise. The cold was opportunity to practice virtue, to endure patiently, to cultivate fortitude. Monks especially embraced this interpretation. Their unheated dormitories and chapters were seen as aids to spiritual discipline. Discomfort focused the mind on higher things, or so the theory went. Whether this helped individual monks actually feel warmer is doubtful, but the framework gave suffering purpose beyond mere biological survival. In secular contexts, endurance was a source of pride and identity. Stories celebrated those who survived extreme hardships. To have lived through the terrible winter of some specific year became a marker of toughness. Communities bonded over shared memories of difficult seasons. We survived that together. It made us stronger. This narrative served social purposes, creating cohesion and shared identity. It also made future hardships easier to face. We've done it before. We can do it again. The transition from winter to spring was gradual and uncertain. False springs occurred. Days of warmth that tricked early flowers into blooming before a killing frost returned. People learned not to trust the first signs of warmth. They'd been fooled before. Firewood had to last until warmth was truly established. Winter clothing stayed accessible. The hearth remained ready to be lit again if cold returned. Only after sustained warming could people finally relax their vigilance. When spring truly arrived, the change was remarkable. Windows could stay open without admitting dangerous cold. Blankets could be stripped from beds and aired in sunshine. The smell of winter, that accumulated odor of smoke and damp wool and unwashed bodies, could finally be banished. Chambers were scrubbed. Rushes were removed and burned, fresh ones laid down. Tapestries were taken down, beaten to remove dust and soot, then stored until the next cold season. The castle itself seemed to exhale, releasing months of trapped stillness. People emerged into sunlight like prisoners freed. They stretched. They walked without being hunched against cold. They felt warmth on their faces and remembered what it was to be comfortable. Spring's arrival wasn't just seasonal change but psychological liberation. The fear that had hung over winter months lifted. Food would be available again. Work could expand outdoors. Life could be lived instead of merely endured. But spring also brought reckoning with winter's toll. Those who had died could now be properly buried. Damage from cold and storms could be assessed and repaired. Bodies that had survived bore marks of the struggle. People were thinner, their food stores depleted. Some bore chilblains and frostbite scars. Coughs lingered for weeks or months. Spring was recovery as much as renewal. Medieval people understood that their survival depended on cycles. Spring's abundance had to sustain through winter's scarcity. Harvest wasn't just gathering food but storing against future hunger. Every decision carried weight. How much grain to save for seed versus eating now? How many animals to slaughter in fall versus keeping through winter? These choices determined whether the next winter would be survivable or catastrophic. The agricultural calendar was survival calendar, and everyone was acutely aware of it. This cyclical thinking shaped medieval consciousness in profound ways. Life wasn't linear progress towards something better. It was endless repetition of patterns. Winter would always come again. Cold would always threaten. The best you could do was prepare, endure, and survive to see another spring. This perspective fostered both fatalism and resilience. You couldn't change the fundamental conditions of existence, but you could develop strategies for living within them. Modern historians debate how harsh medieval climate actually was. Records suggest that the period known as the medieval warm period, roughly 900 to 1300, featured relatively mild temperatures. But even during this warmer era, winters were still challenging by our standards. And in the later Middle Ages, the climate cooled, entering what's called the Little Ice Age. Winters grew longer and more severe. Glaciers advanced. Growing seasons shortened. The harshness that medieval people described in their writings reflected real climatic challenges, not just literary exaggeration. Archaeological evidence supports the written records. Excavations of medieval sites reveal architectural features designed to combat cold. Hearth placements, wall thicknesses, room sizes, all show adaptation to harsh conditions. Analysis of skeletal remains shows markers of cold stress and malnutrition. The bones tell stories that align with the texts. Medieval people genuinely struggled with cold, and it left physical evidence in their bodies and their buildings. The experience of sleeping in medieval castles connects to larger themes of human resilience and adaptation. How do people live in hostile environments? What strategies do they develop? How do material constraints shape culture and psychology? Syria, medieval sleep offers a window into these questions. Shows us humans at their most vulnerable, lying down in darkness and cold, yet finding ways to survive and even to create meaning from hardship. There's something almost touching about the small innovations medieval people developed. The warming pan, the bed curtain, the nightcap, these weren't grand technological breakthroughs. They were humble responses to immediate problems. But cumulatively, they made the difference between life and death. Human ingenuity doesn't always manifest as dramatic invention. Sometimes it's just figuring out how to place a hot stone in your bed to keep your feet from freezing. The communal aspects of medieval sleep also reveal important truths. Privacy, which we now consider essential to comfort, was luxury medieval people mostly did without. They slept in groups because they had to. The modern ideal of individual bedrooms for everyone would have seemed wasteful and even strange. Why would you separate people and waste warmth? The medieval pragmatism about bed sharing, about animals in the bed, about proximity to strangers, shows different priorities. Comfort was collective, not individual. This collective approach extended beyond sleeping arrangements. The entire medieval household functioned as survival unit. Everyone had roles. Everyone contributed. The lord's wealth didn't exempt him from needing servants to maintain fires and prepare warming pans. The peasant's poverty didn't mean he faced winter alone. He had family and community. The interdependence was total. You couldn't survive winter by yourself. The castle, the cottage, the monastery, all were communal enterprises against the cold. Gender roles shaped these survival strategies significantly. Women's work maintaining textiles, preparing food, managing households, caring for the vulnerable, was as essential as men's work providing fuel, maintaining structures, and hunting. Neither could succeed without the other. Winter made this interdependence especially clear. The division of labor was functional, born of necessity rather than ideology, though ideology certainly reinforced it. Children grew up learning their roles in the survival system. Girls learned spinning, weaving, food preservation, child care. Boys learned woodcutting, fire tending, animal husbandry, basic carpentry. These weren't abstract skills but literal survival knowledge. Your ability to perform these tasks determined your ability to live through winter. Education was practical because it had to be. There was no room for knowledge that didn't translate into survival. The elderly held special status as repositories of experience. They remembered past winters, knew signs' importance, could advise on preparation and strategy. Their knowledge had been tested through decades of survival. This gave them authority and value even as their physical capacity declined. A grandmother who remembered the terrible winter 40 years ago could help the household avoid mistakes. Her memory was resource as valuable as grain in the storehouse. Stories and songs preserved and transmitted survival knowledge. Ballads about harsh winters warned what could happen if you were unprepared. Folk tales featured characters who survived through cleverness and preparation, or died through foolishness and neglect. These weren't just entertainment. They were teaching tools, ways to pass vital information across generations in a largely illiterate society. The story of the grasshopper and ant had medieval equivalents, emphasizing the need to prepare for winter while resources were available. Religious stories served similar functions. Biblical narratives about Joseph storing grain against famine resonated deeply in agricultural societies facing seasonal scarcity. Parables about wise and foolish virgins, about masters returning unexpectedly. These carried messages about preparedness that had literal survival applications. Medieval people heard these stories in church and applied them to their daily lives. Scripture and survival intertwined. The castle chapel offered warmth of different kind during winter. Though the building itself was cold, the ritual and community of worship provided psychological comfort. Regular services structured the day and week. The beauty of liturgy, the music, the incense, these created sensory experiences that transcended physical discomfort. For a little while, gathered in prayer, people could feel part of something larger than their immediate suffering. Monks lived according to the divine office, praying at set hours around the clock. This meant they rose multiple times through the night for services. Winter made this particularly demanding. Leaving warm beds to gather in freezing chapels required serious discipline. Yet monks saw this as part of their vocation. They offered their discomfort as prayer, their cold as sacrifice. The monastic life was deliberately austere, and winter simply intensified the asceticism they had chosen. For lay people, religion was more flexible but no less important. Private prayer sustained individuals through difficult nights. Simple practices, crossing yourself before sleep, whispering a favorite psalm, asking a saint's protection, these rituals provided structure and comfort. They weren't magical thinking, though magic and religion often blended in popular practice. They were psychological tools for managing fear and maintaining hope. If you believed God watched over you, winter seemed less overwhelming. Superstition filled gaps that religion left open. Official church teaching condemned many folk practices as pagan survivals, but people clung to them anyway. Why take chances? If hanging garlic helped, if turning shoes warded off frost spirits, If iron under the pillow repelled night demons, then you did these things. Better to be safe than sorry. The line between acceptable piety and forbidden superstition was often unclear, and most people simply did whatever seemed to work. This pragmatic spirituality characterized medieval religious life more generally. People weren't necessarily deeply theological. They couldn't read scripture themselves, and sermons were often in Latin they didn't fully understand. But they had profound sense of the sacred, of forces beyond human control that needed to be appeased or petitioned. Their religion was lived rather than studied, expressed through ritual and practice rather than doctrine and debate. The physical structure of castles reflected religious values, as well as defensive needs. Chapels occupied prominent positions. Crosses marked doorways and windows. Blessings were invoked over new construction. The building itself was understood as existing within divine order. When winter storms battered the walls, people trusted that God's protection was as important as stone thickness. Faith and fortress worked together in medieval imagination. Yet this faith coexisted with deep awareness of fragility. People knew that trust in God didn't guarantee survival. Storms still damaged buildings, cold still killed. Prayers weren't magical shields. Faith provided meaning and comfort, but it didn't change physics. Medieval people lived in this tension, believing in divine providence, while also recognizing the harsh reality of their circumstances. The tension wasn't resolved because it couldn't be, it was simply held. In some ways, this made medieval faith more robust than either naive optimism or cynical despair. It was faith that acknowledged suffering without being destroyed by it. Sincere obedience, people could pray while also piling more blankets. They could trust God while also checking that firewood supplies were adequate. Faith and pragmatism weren't opposites but partners in survival. Both were needed. The castle as physical space contained all these layers of meaning. It was military installation, noble residence, economic center, community hub, and sacred space all at once. The Great Hall served for feasting, judging legal cases, conducting business, and gathering for warmth. The chapel hosted prayer, baptisms, marriages, and funerals. The keep stored grain, housed families, and provided final refuge if walls were breached. Every space had multiple functions because resources were limited and efficiency essential. This multifunctionality extended to furnishings and objects. The bed was sleeping place, but also status symbol and valuable property. Tables in the Great Hall were literally just boards laid on trestles, assembled for meals and then removed. Tapestries were art, insulation, and portable wealth that could be sold in emergency. Everything had to serve multiple purposes. Single-use items were luxuries medieval people couldn't afford. The economy of medieval life was fundamentally different from ours. Most things were made locally from local materials. Trade existed but was limited by poor transportation and security concerns. You couldn't just order replacements for broken items. If your warming pan developed a hole, you repaired it or did without. This enforced a culture of maintenance and resourcefulness. Things were built to last and carefully maintained. Because replacement was difficult, winter intensified this need for self-sufficiency. When snow blocked roads and rivers froze, each household was truly on its own. The supplies you had were all you'd get until spring. Running out meant suffering or death. This concentrated the mind wonderfully, as one chronicle dryly noted. People tracked their stores carefully, they rationed. They made difficult decisions about priority and distribution. Who gets the last of the grain? Who sleeps closest to the fire? These choices had moral and practical dimensions. Historians continue studying how medieval communities made these decisions. Some evidence suggests strong hierarchies where nobles claimed the best resources. Other evidence shows more egalitarian distribution, at least within social classes. The reality probably varied by place and circumstance. Wealthy households could be generous or stingy. Peasant communities could share or fracture under stress. Sincere human nature varied then as now. What's clear is that the decisions mattered intensely and were never easy. The psychological impact of winter's hardships is harder to document, but certainly real. Long periods of discomfort, fear, and darkness affected mental health. Some people became withdrawn and depressed. Others grew irritable and aggressive. The concept of seasonal affective disorder didn't exist, but the reality did. Medieval people noticed that some individuals struggled, especially in winter, that their spirits darkened with the season. The usual explanation was imbalance of humors, but the observation was accurate regardless of the theory behind it. Communities developed informal support systems. Checking on neighbors, especially the isolated elderly, sharing resources when someone was in particular need, gathering for communal activities that provided warmth and distraction. These weren't formalized social services, but rather cultural practices that helped people get through difficult times. The obligations of charity and Christian duty reinforced practical needs for mutual support. Music played an interesting role in winter survival. Songs and instrumental music provided entertainment that required no resources beyond human voice or simple instruments. Gathering to sing was both social activity and warming exercise. The content of songs ranged from religious hymns to bawdy tabern songs, to work songs to lullabies. All served functions beyond mere entertainment. They maintained culture, taught values, expressed emotions, and bound communities together. Dance served similar purposes. In taverns and great halls, people danced to keep warm as much as for fun. The physical exertion generated heat. The communal activity created bonds and released tension. Winter festivals often featured dancing, sometimes wild and exuberant, as people celebrated having survived another portion of the cold season. The physical release after weeks of huddling indoors was probably deeply satisfying. Gaming, from dice to chess to various ball games, occupied time and mind. These activities distracted from discomfort and provided structure to long dark days. Gambling added excitement, though church authorities frowned on it. Card games emerged toward the end of the medieval period, adding another diversion. All these games served psychological function of making time pass more quick. Winter could feel endless. Breaking it into smaller segments through games and gambling made it more bearable. Storytelling was perhaps the most important winter entertainment. Professional storytellers traveled from castle to castle, though travel was limited in deep winter. But every community had its storytellers, people who knew the traditional tales and could tell them well. Epic poems, romances, legends of saints and heroes, these were performed orally, often many times, to audiences who knew them but never tired of hearing them again. The stories provided escape, moral instruction, and cultural continuity. The content of winter stories often reflected seasonal concerns. Tales of heroes enduring hardships resonated differently when told to an audience that was itself enduring hardship. Stories of generous lords who provided for their people during lean times reinforced ideals of proper noble behavior. Cautionary tales about those who failed to prepare for winter served practical purposes. The stories weren't escapist in the modern sense. They were deeply embedded in the lived experience of the audience. This oral culture meant that memory and performance skills were highly valued. The ability to recite long poems or complex genealogies marked someone as educated and cultured. These skills required no literacy, no books, no expensive materials. They resided in the human mind and voice. In a society where most people couldn't read, oral performance was how culture was transmitted and maintained. Winter nights provided time and motivation for this transmission. The castle and cottage at night became theaters, classrooms, churches, and warming centers, all at once. The space condensed function because the cold pushed everyone into the smallest area that could be warmed. In summer, activities spread throughout larger areas. Winter compressed everything to the hearth and the bed. This compression intensified social bonds but also social tensions. You couldn't escape people you didn't like. You had to find ways to coexist because survival depended on it. Conflict resolution became crucial skill. Households and communities developed formal and informal ways to handle disputes. Some had councils or courts that heard grievances. Others relied on authority figures, the lord, the abbot, the village headman, to arbitrate. Still others used social pressure and shame to enforce cooperation. Different systems worked in different contexts, but all recognized that unchecked conflict in winter could be catastrophic. You couldn't allow feuds to destroy the cooperation needed for survival. The end of winter, when it finally came, released these tensions. Spring allowed physical and social space to expand again. People could spread out. They could avoid those they disliked. They could work independently rather than pressed together constantly. The relief was palpable. Spring festivals celebrated not just returning warmth and food but also liberation from winter's forced intimacy. Yet spring brought its own challenges. The hungry gap, late winter and early spring before new food became available, was often the hardest time. Winter stores were depleted. Spring growth hadn't yet matured. People survived on minimal rations, weakened and vulnerable. Disease spread easily through malnourished populations. Spring could be fatal even as it brought promise of better times ahead. The transition period required faith and endurance. You had to trust that food would come, that spring would truly arrive. That you could survive just a little longer. Some years that faith was rewarded. Other years, late frosts killed crops, or spring came so late that the growing season was too short. Then the next winter would be even harder because harvest had been poor. The agricultural cycle could become vicious. Bad weather led to poor harvest, led to insufficient stores, led to suffering and death, led to reduced workforce, led to worse next harvest. Breaking this cycle required good weather, hard work, and luck. Medieval people understood these patterns intimately. Their lives depended on reading weather and seasons correctly. They developed extensive folk knowledge about predicting weather, much of it inaccurate, but some based on real observation. They watched animal behavior, cloud formations, plant growth patterns. They kept mental records of past years and used them to judge current conditions. This knowledge was survival skill as important as any craft or trade. The castle's stone walls, which made winter so miserable, at least provided protection against other dangers. Bandits and raiders also struggled with winter travel. Armies rarely campaigned in deep winter because moving troops and supplies was nearly impossible. So winter brought relative security from human threats even as it increased environmental dangers. The trade-off was accepted. Better to fight cold than swords. This security allowed some reduction in defensive vigilance. Guards still watched walls, but attacks were unlikely. The garrison could thin somewhat as soldiers went home for winter. The castle could focus inward on survival rather than outward on defense. This seasonal rhythm of military activity shaped medieval warfare profoundly. Campaigns had to accomplish objectives before winter, or else armies disbanded and reconvened in spring. Inside the castle, hierarchy remained but softened slightly in winter. Nobles and servants weren't equals, but they shared cold and danger. The lord might have better blankets, but his chamber was still freezing. The servant might have humbler food, but everyone felt hunger as stores dwindled. Shared suffering created, if not equality, at least mutual recognition of common humanity. The strict social divisions that characterized medieval society couldn't quite survive the leveling experience of winter hardship. This leveling was temporary. Spring restored normal hierarchies. But the memory of winter remained. Smart nobles understood that treating dependents decently in winter built loyalty that paid dividends year-round. Harsh lords who hoarded resources, while others suffered, faced resentment and possibly rebellion. The pragmatics of survival created incentives for at least minimal fairness in resource distribution. The historical record preserves glimpses of these dynamics. Account books showing distributions of food and firewood. Legal cases about disputed access to resources. Occasional rebellions that erupted when lords failed their obligations too egregiously. The evidence is fragmentary but suggestive. Medieval people had expectations about reciprocal obligations, and winter tested whether those obligations were honored. Modern historians continue debating the nature of medieval social relations. Were they primarily exploitative, with nobles extracting maximum surplus from peasants? Or were they more reciprocal, with obligations running both ways? The truth probably varied enormously by time, place, and individuals involved, but winter provides particularly useful lens for examining these questions. When survival was at stake, the quality of social relations became literally life or death matter. You can't exploit people beyond a certain point without killing them, and dead peasants don't produce surplus. Some minimum level of care was necessary for the system to function. This calculus was rarely articulated explicitly. Medieval people didn't think in terms of economic optimization, but the patterns of behavior suggest implicit understanding. Lords who wanted stable, prosperous estates needed to ensure their dependents survived winter. This might mean distributing emergency food supplies, organizing communal wood gathering, providing space in castle outbuildings for vulnerable families. These weren't altruistic actions but rather investments in maintaining a productive population. From the peasant side, enduring lordly demands was partly about lacking alternatives, but also about receiving protections and supports that individual families couldn't provide alone. The manor system, for all its inequities, organized resource pooling and risk-sharing. Bad harvest hit everyone, but collective stores meant that complete catastrophe might be avoided. This didn't make serfdom pleasant or just, but it explains why the system persisted for centuries. It provided survival framework in a harsh, uncertain world. These patterns connect to larger themes in human history. How do societies organize to survive in difficult environments? What institutions emerge to pool risk and resources? How are benefits and burdens distributed? Medieval winter sleep, seemingly a narrow topic, opens into these vast questions. The specific strategies people use to stay warm at night reflect broader social, economic, and cultural systems. Everything connects. And now, as this long exploration draws toward close, picture once more that castle chamber. The sleeper we imagined at the beginning has survived winter. The bed curtains have been opened countless times. The warming pan has made its nightly rounds. The dog has curled up faithfully at the foot. The fire has been rebuilt each morning, and slowly, gradually, the days have lengthened. Light returns earlier and lingers later. The sun's angle shifts, bringing more warmth. Icicles begin dripping from eaves during afternoon, even if they refreeze at night. One morning, you wake to realize the chamber isn't quite as brutally cold. The frost patterns on the shutters are less elaborate. The hearth fire catches more easily. Your breath still fogs, but less thickly. Something has shifted. Winter is loosening its grip. It will be weeks still before warmth truly returns, before blankets can be packed away and windows left open. But the trajectory has changed. You have survived. Spring is coming. The knowledge spreads through the castle and village. People notice the signs together. They comment on them, comparing observations, cautiously allowing hope. No one wants to celebrate too early, to be fooled by a false spring. But the cumulative evidence builds. Birds return. Snow melts in patches. The ground softens in sunny spots. Winter is ending, and when spring truly arrives, confirmed beyond doubt, the relief is profound. People emerge into sunlight as though reborn. They shed layers of clothing. They open buildings to fresh air. They clean with energy born of long pent-up frustration with winter's dirt. The world comes back to life, and so do they. But they also remember. The memory of winter's cold, its dangers and discomforts, shapes how they live the rest of the year. Summer's warmth is sweeter for having survived winter's chill. Harvest's abundance is more carefully preserved, knowing what scarcity means. Every preparation for next winter carries the weight of memory. This cycle defined medieval existence. It shaped consciousness, culture, and community. And so the tale closes as it began, with sleep. But now we understand that medieval sleep was never simple rest. It was achievement, victory, survival. To lie down at night and wake in the morning was success. To do this through an entire winter was triumph. The strategies we've explored, the warming pans and bed curtains, the dogs and blankets, the prayers and stories, all these were weapons in a war against cold and darkness. And the noble people, for all their hardships, won that war night after night, generation after generation. So rest now in your own warm bed, grateful for heating systems and insulation, for reliable shelter and abundant resources. But spare a thought for those long-ago sleepers who had none of these yet survived anyway through ingenuity and stubborn endurance. Their nights were cold, but their determination was fierce. And in that determination, in those countless small acts of survival, lived a kind of greatness that deserves to be remembered. The morning after winter's end arrives differently than all the mornings before. The chamber no longer feels like an adversary. The stone walls, which spent months radiating cold, now simply stand neutral. The air carries a different quality, no longer sharp and hostile, but merely cool. You stretch beneath blankets without dreading the moment of emergence. The fire in the hearth, if it even burned through the night, matters less urgently. Spring has not just returned to the world outside, but has begun creeping through arrow slits and under doorways, reclaiming interior spaces from winter's occupation. Servants move through corridors with lighter steps, the drudgery of maintaining fires, hauling endless firewood, scraping ice from surfaces, all this eases. Their work doesn't disappear, but its desperateness fades. They can accomplish tasks without racing against cold and darkness. Windows are thrown open to admit not just light but air that doesn't immediately threaten everyone with freezing. The castle begins to breathe properly for the first time in months, exhaling winter's stolness and inhaling spring's freshness. The great hall transforms most dramatically. What was survival shelter becomes social space again. Tables remain set up longer because gathering near the hearth isn't essential. Meals spread out, become more leisurely, shift from pure fuel consumption to something approaching pleasure. Fresh foods begin appearing, first sparingly, then with increasing abundance. Wild greens foraged from fields, eggs from chickens that resume laying, fish from rivers and streams that ice no longer locks. The monotony of preserved foods breaks, and with it breaks some of the psychological weight of winter. Children who spent months confined and restless explode into activity. They race through courtyards, climb walls they're not supposed to climb, shout and laugh with energy that's been bottled up for half a year. Adults watch with mixed exasperation and relief. Yes, the noise is tremendous. Yes, they're getting into mischief, but the alternative, listless children trapped indoors, was worse. This chaos signals health and vitality returning. The physical landscape around castles and villages transforms weekly. Snow retreats from exposed slopes first, leaving brown earth that looks ugly but precious. Mud becomes omnipresent, tracked everywhere. A nuisance that no one truly minds because it means winter's iron grip has broken. Gradually green returns, first in sheltered spots then spreading. Trees bud. Their branches no longer bear black lines against grey sky but softening with promise of leaves. Agricultural work resumes with urgency that differs from winter's desperate survival mode. This urgency contains hope rather than fear. Fields must be ploughed and planted while weather permits. Every day of delay risks shortening the growing season and reducing eventual harvest. But the work itself, though exhausting, connects people to life and growth. You're not just enduring anymore, you're building towards something. The future stretches ahead with possibility rather than simply more cold darkness. Medieval farming was brutally hard work. Oxen pulled heavy ploughs through soil that resisted breaking. Men walked behind, guiding the blade, fighting the plough's tendency to catch on roots and rocks. Others followed, breaking clods and scattering seed. Women and children covered the seed and chased birds. Everyone worked from dawn until exhaustion, day after day, yet spring planting was almost joyful compared to winter's grinding anxiety. This work meant something was growing. The fields themselves were organized according to systems that balanced individual and communal needs. In many regions, the open field system prevailed, with each family holding scattered strips throughout several large fields. One field might lie fallow each year, recovering fertility. Crop rotation prevented soil exhaustion. These practices emerged from centuries of trial and error, representing accumulated wisdom about how to sustain agriculture in marginal conditions. They weren't efficient by modern standards, but they worked within medieval constraints. Livestock that survived winter emerged gaunt and weak. Cattle and sheep had been kept alive on minimal fodder, their bodies consuming muscle and fat to sustain life. Spring grass, when it finally came, was like medicine. Animals grazed desperately, regaining condition. Their survival was crucial. Oxen provided plow power. Cows gave milk. Sheep provided wool. Losing animals meant losing not just meat, but essential tools and materials for survival. Some animals didn't survive. Winter inevitably claimed the weakest. Spring revealed the casualties. Dead livestock represented significant loss. Each animal had value beyond its meat, and replacing it took years. A family that lost its ox faced catastrophic hardship. They might borrow or rent another's ox, going into debt. They might pool resources with neighbors, sharing animals and labor. Medieval farming required cooperation precisely because individual families often lacked everything needed to farm independently. The church calendar marked spring's arrival with its own rhythms. Lent, that period of fasting before Easter, often coincided with the hungry gap. This alignment made spiritual discipline reflect material reality. You were supposed to fast during Lent, but that wasn't so different from the fasting imposed by depleted stores. Easter's arrival brought not just religious celebration but permission to feast on foods that were finally becoming available. The liturgical and agricultural calendars intertwined, each reinforcing the other. Easter celebrations in medieval communities were elaborate affairs. The long Lenten fast ended. Meat was consumed again after weeks of abstinence. Eggs, which chickens resumed laying in spring, were blessed and decorated. The Easter Vigil on Holy Saturday night featured fire and light ceremonies that resonated deeply with people who had spent months fighting darkness and cold. Christ's resurrection became metaphor for the world's resurrection from winter death. The religious symbolism drew power from material reality. People dressed in their best for Easter services. Clothing that had been packed away during winter's worst emerged for inspection. Sometimes moths or mildew had damaged precious garments. But wearing fine clothes again, feeling festive rather than simply bundled for survival, marked psychological transition. You weren't just enduring anymore. You could think about appearance, about celebration, about things beyond immediate survival needs. The social season resumed with spring. Nobles who had been isolated in their estates during winter began traveling again. Roads, though muddy, became passable. Messengers moved between estates. Courts reconvened. Legal business that had been suspended during winter months resumed. The network of obligations, alliances, and enmities that characterized medieval political life reactivated. Winter had paused but not ended the game of power. Warfare too awaited spring's arrival. Armies that had disbanded for winter began mustering. Lords called up their feudal levies, professional soldiers emerged from garrison duty ready for campaign. The fighting season opened, typically running from late spring through early autumn. Wars had to accomplish their objectives within this window, or else pause for another winter. The rhythm of medieval warfare was fundamentally seasonal, shaped by the same agricultural and climatic forces that governed everything else. Tournaments and festivals provided outlets for martial energy and entertainment. These elaborate events brought together nobles from wide areas. They featured jousting, melee combat, archery contests, and other demonstrations of military skill. But they also served social functions, allowing alliance building, marriage negotiations, and display of wealth and status. The tournament season was spring and summer, times when travel was feasible and when gathering large groups wasn't suicidal. For common people, spring meant different kinds of gatherings. Villages held festivals marking planting's completion or celebrating saints' days. These combined religious observance with thoroughly secular merrymaking. People danced, drank, sang, played games, gossiped, courted, and generally released months of pent-up energy. Church authorities often disapproved of these festivals' rowdier elements but couldn't fully suppress them. The need for communal celebration after winter's isolation was too strong. Marriage patterns followed seasonal rhythms as well. Spring and early summer saw spikes in weddings. Partly this was practical. Travel was easier, allowing guests to attend. Food was more abundant for wedding feasts. But it also reflected that spring was time of beginnings, of hope, of life renewing itself. Marriages celebrated during this season carried symbolic weight. They aligned with the world's rebirth. Pregnancy and childbirth also followed seasonal patterns, though less by choice than by circumstance. Conceptions tended to peak in late spring and early summer, leading to births in late winter and early spring. This timing was actually problematic. Late winter births happened during the hungry gap when mothers were often malnourished and resources scarce. But human fertility responded to factors like nutrition and daylight that naturally varied seasonally. Medieval people couldn't control these patterns. They simply endured the consequences. The high infant mortality rate in medieval times was partly seasonal. Winter births faced harsh conditions. Mothers struggled to keep babies warm and adequately fed. Infections and respiratory illnesses threatened newborns constantly. Many children died within their first year. Those who survived that first year had much better odds of reaching adulthood, but that first year was brutal lottery. Families celebrated a child's first birthday with profound relief and gratitude. Childhood in medieval times was simultaneously brief and extended. Children were expected to contribute to household work from young ages. 4- and 5-year-olds could tend smaller animals, collect eggs, help with spinning and simple food preparation. By 7 or 8, children were doing real labor, working in fields or workshops, learning trades. Yet they weren't considered fully adult until much later, often not until marriage. This intermediate period, what we might call adolescence, lasted years. Young people in medieval society occupied ambiguous position. They had significant responsibilities but limited authority. They were no longer protected as children but not yet independent as adults. For boys, this often meant serving as apprentices or as members of noble households, learning skills while providing labor. For girls, it meant helping mothers with household management while waiting for marriage. Both genders existed in this liminal state, working toward but not yet arrived at full adulthood. Education, such as it existed, was mostly practical and informal. Children learned by watching and doing. The blacksmith's son learned smithing by helping in the forge. A weaver's daughter learned weaving by sitting beside her mother at the loom. This apprenticeship model transmitted knowledge effectively within established trades but didn't encourage innovation. You learned to do things as they'd always been done. Change came slowly and usually from necessity rather than experimentation. Formal schooling was rare and mostly limited to preparing boys for religious life or for administrative roles requiring literacy. Monasteries maintained schools. Some cathedrals had schools attached. Wealthy noble families sometimes hired tutors for their sons, occasionally for daughters as well, but the vast majority of medieval people never learned to read. This doesn't mean they were ignorant. They possessed vast amounts of practical knowledge about agriculture, weather, animals, local history, and oral traditions. They were illiterate, but not uneducated. The division between literate and illiterate culture shaped medieval society profoundly. Those who could read had access to different knowledge sources. They could engage with religious texts, legal documents, classical learning. This created power differential. Clerics, because they were literate, held monopoly on certain kinds of knowledge. They interpreted scripture, drafted legal documents, kept records. This gave church tremendous influence, even in secular affairs, yet oral culture remained vibrant and important. Stories, songs, proverbs, and practical knowledge circulated without need for writing. People memorized vast amounts of information. Skilled storytellers could recite epic poems lasting hours. Farmers knew weather lore and agricultural techniques passed down through generations. Craftspeople held trade secrets in their heads. This oral knowledge was no less valuable for being unwritten. Often it was more practical and immediately useful than book learning. The relationship between written and oral culture was complex. They didn't simply oppose each other. Written documents often originated in oral testimony. Legal cases involved witnesses reciting what they knew. Chronicles recorded oral traditions. Conversely, written texts were usually read aloud. The silent private reading we practice today was uncommon. Books were scarce and expensive. When someone had access to a book, they typically read it aloud to others. Hearing remained the primary way most people encountered written culture. Manuscripts themselves were extraordinary objects in medieval world. Each book was handwritten, often beautifully illuminated with decorated capitals and illustrations. Creating a manuscript took months or years of painstaking labor. Scribes suffered eye strain, hand cramps, and chronic pain from hunching over desks. The materials were expensive. Parchment required processing animal skins. Inks and pigments had to be manufactured. Gold leaf for the most elaborate manuscripts was literally gold. A single book might represent value equal to a farm. Books were therefore treasured and guarded carefully. Monastery libraries chained valuable books to desks. Lending books required serious security. Wealthy collectors prided themselves on their libraries, but access to these books remained restricted. You couldn't simply borrow a book as we do from libraries today. Books were precious objects that signaled both wealth and learning. The content of medieval books reflected the priorities of those who could afford to produce them. Religious texts dominated. Bibles, psalters, prayer books, theological treatises, lives of saints. These served both devotional and educational purposes. After religious text came legal documents and administrative records. Chronicles and histories preserved memories of important events. Classical texts, works by Greek and Roman authors, circulated in limited copies. Secular literature, romances, and poetry existed but was proportionally small part of manuscript production. The romances that did exist reveal fascinating aspects of medieval imagination. Stories of King Arthur and his knights, tales of Charlemagne. Romances featuring courtly love, quests, magical objects, and moral dilemmas. These stories operated on different register than religious texts. They explored human desires, conflicts, and aspirations in ways that theological writing didn't. They were entertainment but also cultural instruction, teaching ideals about nobility, bravery, loyalty, and proper behavior. Women featured prominently in many romances. Though their portrayal was complex and sometimes contradictory, some female characters were powerful and capable. Others were passive objects of male desire. The ideal of courtly love placed ladies on pedestals, worshipped from afar by noble knights. But this literary idealization coexisted with misogynistic texts that portrayed women as sources of sin and temptation. Medieval culture contained multitudes, contradictory attitudes, that weren't necessarily resolved into coherent philosophy. Real women's lives differed considerably from literary portraits. Noble women managed estates when husbands were away at war or on business. They supervised servants, handled finances, negotiated agreements. Some became quite powerful. The stereotype of medieval women as uniformly oppressed and powerless is false. Their power was certainly constrained by patriarchal structures, but within those constraints, capable women could exercise significant authority and influence. Peasant women's lives revolved around household production. They spun wool, wove cloth, brewed ale, made butter and cheese, preserved food, kept gardens, raised chickens and other small livestock. Their labor was essential to household survival. They also worked in fields during peak agricultural seasons, planting and harvesting alongside men. The sexual division of labor was flexible when necessity demanded. Survival required everyone's contribution regardless of theoretical gender roles. Widows occupied special position in medieval society. A widow gained control of her late husband's property according to dower rights. This gave her unusual independence. She could manage estates, run businesses, make contracts. Some widows remarried quickly, seeking the protection and partnership marriage offered. Others remained single, preferring the autonomy widowhood provided. The legal and social position of widows was more complex and sometimes more favorable than that of married women. Children born outside marriage faced significant disadvantages. Illegitimacy carried social stigma and legal disabilities. Bastards couldn't inherit. They faced restrictions on entering religious orders or holding certain offices, yet enforcement of these rules varied. Powerful men acknowledged their illegitimate children and provided for them. Some bastards rose to prominence despite their birth. The rules existed but weren't applied uniformly. Family structures adapted to economic and social circumstances. Among peasants, nuclear families were common, though extended family often lived nearby and cooperated economically. Noble families were more complex, with multiple generations and various relations living together in large households. Servants and retainers blurred lines between family and employees. The household, rather than the biological family, was the functional unit. Inheritance patterns shaped family dynamics significantly. Primogeniture, where the eldest son inherited everything, was common among nobles. This preserved estates intact but left younger sons needing to find their own paths. They might enter church, serve in someone else's household, become knights errant, or marry heiresses if they could. Daughters were generally excluded from inheriting if any sons existed. They received dowries instead, property or money meant to help attract husbands. Peasant inheritance was more variable. Some regions practiced partible inheritance, dividing property among all children. This promoted equality but also fragmented holdings. Other regions followed primogeniture like nobles. Still others had customs allowing parents significant discretion in dividing property. The diversity of local customs across medieval Europe was enormous. Generalizations break down quickly when examining specific communities. Marriage itself was a complex institution. Church law defined it as sacrament requiring consent of both parties. This theoretically gave even women right to refuse matches. In practice, families often pressured or coerced children into advantageous marriages. Among nobles, marriages were diplomatic and economic treaties. Love was fortunate bonus but not requirement or even expectation. People hoped affection might grow over time but didn't demand it at start. The marriage process involved multiple stages. First came betrothal, formal agreement between families. Betrothals were legally binding and could be enforced. Later came the actual marriage ceremony, increasingly a church rite, though earlier medieval marriages could be secular contract. Finally came consummation, which completed the marriage legally and made it much harder to annul. This multi-stage process created ambiguous situations. Were betrothed couples married or not? Different authorities answered differently at different times. Divorce, as we understand it, didn't exist. Marriage was permanent in church teaching. However, annulments were possible on various grounds. If the marriage was never properly formed, perhaps because parties were too closely related, or because one party was coerced, it could be annulled. This meant the marriage was declared never to have existed. Powerful people could usually find grounds for annulment if they wanted out badly enough, and could pressure church courts. Common people had less access to this option. Widowhood dissolved marriage naturally. Remarriage was permitted and common, though church sometimes discouraged it, especially for widows. The practical need for economic partnership often outweighed religious reservations. Widows with property were particularly likely to remarry, since they brought assets that made them attractive matches. Widows with children needed someone to manage household and care for children. Economics drove many remarriages. Old age in medieval times was less common than today simply because fewer people lived long enough to experience it. Life expectancy statistics are misleading because high infant mortality drags down the average. As Oritier Sire, if you survived childhood diseases and avoided death in childbirth or warfare, you had reasonable chance of reaching your 60s or even 70s. But these elderly survivors were minority. Most people died younger. Those who did reach old age faced challenges. Physical labor became difficult or impossible. Without social security or pensions, elderly people depended on family or community charity. In peasant families, the older generation typically transferred control of the land to adult children, retaining right to be supported. These arrangements were formalized in contracts specifying what the old people would receive. So much grain per year, space in the house, firewood, clothing. The contracts reveal both the vulnerability of elderly and the seriousness with which these obligations were taken. Elderly people contributed what they could. They cared for grandchildren. They preserved and transmitted knowledge. They participated in religious life, praying for the community. Their presence represented continuity and memory. In cultures without writing or with limited literacy, old people were living libraries, repositories of information about how things had been done, about past events, about family history and local traditions. Some elderly chose religious retirement. Entering a monastery or convent late in life offered security and community. Religious houses were expected to care for their members, including the aged and infirm. Lay people sometimes made donations to religious houses in exchange for corridors, basically medieval retirement plans guaranteeing food and shelter for life. These arrangements were mutually beneficial. The religious house gained resources while the elderly person gained security. Death, when it came, was handled according to well-established rituals. The dying person ideally had time to prepare, receiving last rites and making peace with God and neighbors. Family gathered around the deathbed. The dying person might make oral will or statement of final wishes. After death, the body was washed and dressed, watched over by family and friends, then buried, usually within a day or two. Speed was necessary without embalming or refrigeration. Burial location depended on status. Common people were buried in churchyards, their graves marked simply or not at all. Nobles might be buried inside churches, their tombs elaborate monuments. Religious people were buried in monastery cemeteries, their tombs elaborate monuments. Religious people were buried in monastery cemeteries. The exact location mattered because of beliefs about resurrection. Bodies would rise at final judgment, and proximity to church or holy ground was considered advantageous. Mourning followed prescribed patterns. Widows wore specific clothing and observed periods of seclusion. Families held memorial masses. The wealthy endowed chantries, chapels where priests said masses perpetually for the deceased's soul. The living maintained relationships with the dead through prayer and commemoration. Death didn't sever bonds but transformed them. The dead remained part of the community, though in different realm. Beliefs about the afterlife shaped responses to death. Christian teaching promised heaven for the saved and hell for the damned, with purgatory as intermediate state where souls were purified. This framework gave meaning to suffering and death. Life was temporary testing ground. True eternal life began after death. This belief helped people cope with harsh conditions and frequent loss. Death wasn't final end but transition to next phase. Yet alongside orthodox teaching ran currents of folk belief. Ghosts and spirits of the dead appeared in stories and testimonies. Some dead were said to haunt the living, especially if they died violently or with unfinished business. Protective rituals and prayers aimed to keep dangerous dead at bay while honoring beneficial ancestors. The boundary between official church teaching and popular belief was porous. People held multiple views simultaneously without seeing contradiction. This layering of beliefs characterized medieval religious life generally. Ordinary people combined Christian teaching with folk practices that predated Christianity. They prayed to saints but also consulted wise women for charms. They attended Mass, but also observed seasonal customs with pagan roots. The Church alternately condemned, tolerated, and absorbed these practices. Purifying folk belief was an ongoing project that never fully succeeded. The seasonal year contained this mixture. Christian holy days overlaid earlier festivals. Christmas coincided with winter solstice celebrations. Easter absorbed spring fertility rites. Harvest festivals became thanksgivings to Christian God but retained older elements. Midsummer celebrations honored John the Baptist but also echoed pre-Christian fire festivals. The church calendar Christianized the year, while folk customs persisted beneath official layer. This synthesis created richly textured culture. People experienced the sacred and supernatural as immediate and present. Saints interceded in daily affairs. Relics held miraculous power. Demons tempted and threatened. Angels protected. The spiritual and material worlds interpenetrated constantly. Medieval people lived in an enchanted universe where invisible forces constantly affected visible reality. Modern historians debate how literally medieval people believed their own stories. Were accounts of miracles and visions genuine belief or pious fraud? Did people truly experience the supernatural events they reported? Or were they using conventional language to describe other experiences? These questions can't be answered definitively. Probably belief existed along a spectrum. Some were deeply credulous, others were skeptical. Most fell somewhere between, believing some things while doubting others. What's clear is that the framework of Christian belief provided structure for understanding the world. It explained suffering, gave meaning to hardship, promised ultimate justice, and offered hope of salvation. Without this framework, medieval life might have seemed unbearably harsh and pointless. Religion wasn't opiate in the sense of escape from reality. It was lens through which reality was interpreted and made bearable. The church as institution was enormously powerful. It held vast lands. It collected tithes from everyone. It claimed authority over spiritual matters, including marriage, death, and salvation. It influenced political affairs through its relationship with rulers. It provided education, healthcare, and social services. It was simultaneously spiritual community and political power. These dual roles sometimes conflicted, leading to corruption and abuse. But they also meant the church was embedded in every aspect of medieval life. Monasticism represented an attempt to live Christian ideals more perfectly than was possible in the world. Monks and nuns took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. They withdrew from worldly concerns to focus on prayer and spiritual development. But monasteries were also economic enterprises, managing extensive properties, producing goods, engaging in trade. They were centers of learning where manuscripts were copied and preserved. They were hospitals caring for the sick. They were places of refuge for travelers and the desperate. The tension between monastic ideals and practical realities produced ongoing reforms. New orders emerged claiming to return to pure observance. The Cluniacs reformed Benedictine monasticism. The Cistercians sought even stricter simplicity. The Franciscans embraced radical poverty. Each wave of reform criticized the wealth and worldliness of established monasteries and promised renewal. Yet, over time, successful reforms often led to new accumulation of wealth, starting the cycle again. This pattern reflected broader medieval tension between ideals and practice. People knew how they should live according to Christian teaching. Few managed it consistently. The gap between ideal and reality created guilt and anxiety, but also drove attempts at reform and renewal. Medieval culture contained self-critique, awareness of its own failings. This produced both pessimism about human nature and hope that redemption was possible. The apocalyptic strain in medieval thought reflected this tension. Many believed they lived in end times, that Christ's return was imminent. Plagues, famines, wars, all were interpreted as signs of approaching judgment. This expectation shaped behavior, sometimes encouraging repentance and reform, other times producing fatalism or even wild millenarian movements. The sense that history was reaching its conclusion affected everything from personal choices to political events. Yet daily life continued regardless of apocalyptic expectations. Fields still needed plowing, children needed raising, houses required maintenance. The rhythm of ordinary existence persisted through crisis and calm. This was perhaps the deepest reality of medieval life. Whatever grand narratives played out in politics and religion, most people focused on immediate tasks necessary for survival and continuity. Spring planting embodied this focus on continuity. You planted knowing you might not live to harvest. Disease or accident could strike any time. But you planted anyway because what else could you do? The seed went into the earth carrying hope and faith that autumn would come, that crops would grow, that life would continue. This act of faith repeated every year was perhaps medieval culture's deepest statement of purpose. The seeds themselves represented accumulated wisdom. Farmers saved best grain from each harvest to plant next year. Over generations, this selection improved crop varieties, adapting them to local conditions. Medieval farmers couldn't explain genetics or evolution, but they practiced artificial selection effectively. The grains they planted were products of centuries of careful observation and choice. Crop diversity was greater than many realize. Wheat was prestigious but difficult to grow in many areas. Rye, barley, and oats were more reliable in northern climates. Peas and beans provided protein. Various vegetables grew in gardens. Different regions specialized in different crops based on soil and climate. This diversity provided some protection against total crop failure. If one crop failed, others might succeed. Animal husbandry followed similar principles. Farmers bred animals selectively, choosing which to keep and which to slaughter. Over time, distinct regional breeds emerged. Sheep in one area developed traits suited to local pastures. Cattle adapted to their environment. The animals that survived and reproduced were those best fitted to medieval farming conditions. The knowledge required for successful agriculture was vast and detailed. When to plant each crop, how to prepare soil, which animals to breed, how to manage manure to maintain fertility, when to harvest, how to store grain, how to process flax and wool. Farmers had to be experts in dozens of skills. They learned through experience and from elders who passed down accumulated knowledge. This knowledge was mostly tacit, embedded in practice rather than written in book. Agricultural manuals existed but were rare and not particularly useful. They described idealized estates that didn't match most farming reality. Real knowledge resided in farmers' bodies and minds, in their ability to read weather and soil, to judge animal health, to time operations correctly. Women's agricultural knowledge was particularly unrecorded. They managed gardens, dairy operations, poultry. They processed grain into flour and flour into bread. They brewed ale. They preserved food. They knew medicinal and culinary herbs. All this expertise was transmitted mother to daughter, rarely written down because women were less likely to be literate. Yet it was essential. Households couldn't function without this knowledge. The seasonality of medieval life meant that different times demanded different knowledge and skills. Spring required planting expertise. Summer demanded understanding of crop growth and pest management. Autumn was harvest, requiring organizational skills and speed. Winter meant preservation and maintenance. No single person mastered everything. Households and communities pooled knowledge, with different members having different specialties. This specialization extended to crafts and trades. Blacksmiths knew metal work. Carpenters knew wood. Weavers knew textiles. Potters knew clay. Each craft had its techniques, its secrets, its apprenticeship system. Guilds in towns regulated trades, maintaining standards and protecting members' interests. The guild system was both protective and restrictive, ensuring quality but also limiting competition. Towns themselves were growing during later medieval period. Trade and manufacturing increasingly concentrated in urban centers. Towns developed distinct culture and institutions. They had different laws than countryside. Town air makes free, went the saying, meaning serfs who escaped to towns and lived there for a year gained freedom. Towns represented opportunity but also danger. Disease spread more easily in crowded conditions. Fire was constant threat in timber buildings packed tightly together. Urban life differed dramatically from rural existence. People lived closer together. They were more anonymous, less known to neighbors. They depended on markets for food rather than growing their own. They worked for wages or ran businesses rather than farming. The rhythm of work followed craft demands rather than agricultural seasons. Town and country were increasingly distinct worlds, though still interconnected economically. Yet most people still lived rurally. Towns were small by modern standards. Even large cities held populations measured in tens of thousands, not millions. The vast majority of medieval Europeans were peasant farmers living in villages, working land, following seasonal rhythms, maintaining traditions that connected them to the past. They were the foundation on which everything else rested. Their labor fed everyone. Their survival meant society survived. And so we return to where we began, to those individual moments of sleeping and waking, of surviving night and facing dawn. Whether in castle or cottage, whether noble or peasant, whether monk or merchant, people closed their eyes in darkness and hoped to open them to light. They fought cold with ingenuity, community, and determination. They endured. Their endurance created history. Not the grand history of kings and battles, though that happened too, but the deeper history of human persistence, of ordinary people living through difficult times, adapting, surviving, passing life to next generation. That continuity, maintained through countless small acts across centuries, is the real achievement. Medieval sleep, which seemed such a narrow topic, opens into this vast story. How people slept reveals how they lived, what they valued, what they feared, how they organized themselves, what tools and knowledge they possessed, how they understood their world. The warming pan and the bed curtain, the prayer and the dog curled at your feet. All these were not just practical responses to cold but expressions of medieval culture in its entirety. And now night falls once more in our imagined medieval world. The castle settles into familiar routines. Fires are built up. Warming pans make their rounds. Blankets are piled and curtains drawn. Dogs claim their spots. Prayers are whispered. People lie down to rest after another day of labor, knowing tomorrow will bring more of the same. But tomorrow is also promise. Tomorrow the work continues. Tomorrow seeds germinate, and animals graze, and children grow. Tomorrow life persists against all the forces that threaten it. And in that persistence, in that stubborn refusal to yield, lies something profound and worthy of remembrance. So close your eyes now in your own comfortable bed, in your warm room, surrounded by abundance that medieval people couldn't imagine. Sleep peacefully, knowing that your ancestors, generation after generation, stretching back across centuries, also slept and woke and continued. They gave you life through their survival. Honor them by remembering their struggle, their ingenuity, and their endurance. The long medieval night is over, but its lessons remain. Good night.